1865, a young woman named Hannah Culvick stood in the cold office of a London employment agency. She stared straight ahead while the stern manager squeezed her wrists, checking the thickness of her bones and the firmness of her skin. This was followed by a curt order to open her mouth for a detailed examination of her teeth, which determined the candidate's physical endurance. Hannah straightened her back, realizing that the slightest slump in her posture would forever deprive her of the chance to secure a position in a wealthy mansion. In this oppressive silence, her fate was being decided, entirely dependent on whether her body would be deemed fit for grueling work. I discovered this entirely by chance while studying the archives of Victorian employment agencies. What went on behind the closed doors of these respectable establishments seems absolutely unthinkable today. People pay huge sums of money for the illusion of a noble era, forgetting the harsh reality behind the luxurious lifestyle. The secret, passed down through old contracts, conceals a vast system for evaluating the human body. This hidden truth will shock you with its cynicism and cold, pragmatic calculation. Can you guess how many lives were ruined because of a single wrong answer during such an interview? You'll see the actual lists of requirements that candidates had to meet before they could even cross the threshold of a master's home. We'll walk the entire path alongside the historical figures who built this system and tried to tear it down. You'll learn why an impeccable reputation was worth more than gold, and how a black market for fake references developed. This story will reveal the mechanisms of control that operated in every wealthy household in London. Watch the video to the end, and you'll discover the true cost of securing a simple job in the gleaming mansions of the British elite. In 1861, a young writer named Isabella Beeton published a book that forever changed British society. Her ambitious work was a veritable code of laws for managing domestic staff. Isabella approached the organization of household life with the precision of a military strategist, outlining each employee's duties down to the smallest detail. She believed that order in the state inevitably begins with perfect discipline in the private home. It was her standards that formed the basis for the very strict screening processes that job seekers faced at employment agencies. The book clearly outlined a budget, specifying the number of servants required for a family with a certain income. Isabella Beeton divided the staff into strict categories, creating a rigid internal hierarchy. At the top of this pyramid was the house manager, while at the very bottom were the dishwashers and kitchen assistants. The author asserted that blurring these roles would inevitably lead to chaos and the destruction of domestic harmony. As a result, employers began seeking not just people, but ideal cogs for their domestic machinery. Each candidate had to match the description set forth in the pages of the famous handbook exactly. Mrs. Beeton's system transformed domestic labor into a strictly regulated industry. Employers would visit agencies with the book open, comparing the applicant's qualifications with the printed recommendations. Any deviation from the standard was considered a sign of bad taste and reflected poorly on the homeowners. Each profession required its own set of physical attributes and psychological qualities. For example, tall stature was a prerequisite for footmen, as they represented the household to guests. Cooks, on the other hand, were judged by the cleanliness of their hands and their ability to remain calm under extreme stress. Before this book was published, hiring rules were passed down orally and depended on the personal preferences of the individual employer. Now, however, the process had been standardized, transforming London into a massive marketplace for domestic labor. Agency owners quickly recognized the commercial benefits of the new standards and began introducing their own forms for rigorous record keeping. Every field in these documents demanded a precise answer, leaving no room for human individuality. Applicants were reduced to a set of measurable characteristics that could be assessed in monetary terms. It was a triumph of bureaucracy over simple human interaction. Isabella Beeton had never personally worked as an employee, but her vision became the absolute truth for thousands of employers. She created the image of the ideal employee, who was supposed to remain invisible while ensuring impeccable comfort. The rules placed particular emphasis on the visual uniformity of the staff. The uniform became a symbol of belonging to a specific household and a way to erase the employee's individual traits. Isabella described in detail which fabrics should be used for morning work attire and which for evening receptions. Violations of the dress code were punishable by fines or immediate dismissal without severance pay. Applicants were required to demonstrate a willingness to wear whatever uniform the mistress chose for them. Refusal to wear a bonnet or a uniform apron automatically put an end to one's career in respectable society. Despite the strictness of the rules, the book enjoyed phenomenal success among the growing middle class. The nouveau riche, who had amassed their fortunes during the Industrial Revolution, desperately needed guidance on how to live properly. They adopted aristocratic habits, emulating the behavior of the old elite through the management of their staff. Hiring the right servants became a way to affirm their new social status. Employment agencies turned into a sort of boutique where prestige was sold in the form of skilled workers. This book legitimized the right of some people to exercise total control over the lives of others. Mrs. Beeton's rules also regulated working hours and rest periods, leaving employees with a minimum of personal space. A day off was granted extremely rarely, usually once every 2 weeks for a few hours to attend church. The rest of the time, a person was entirely at the disposal of their employers, awaiting orders at any moment of the day or night. This system demanded immense physical and psychological endurance, which was tested even before the contract was signed. Weak or independent-minded individuals were quickly weeded out during the preliminary screening process. Those who remained formed a silent army that ensured the comfort of Victorian England. The historical significance of this document lies in the fact that it captured the social divide of the era. The rules clearly delineated the boundary between those who gave orders and those who were obliged to carry them out unquestioningly. Isabella Beeton created a framework by which British society functioned for many decades. Her work became a kind of unquestionable constitution for domestic life. Even after the author's death in 1865, her book continued to be published in print runs of millions. We'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about such strict rules for running a household? Please share your thoughts in the comments. London's employment agencies consisted of spacious halls where real-life dramas unfolded every day. Hannah Carwick, an experienced worker, described these places as cold markets where people were judged by their muscle mass. The process began with a visual inspection, during which the office manager scrutinized the applicant's physique. Being overweight was considered a sign of laziness, while being excessively thin raised suspicions of poor health. The ideal candidate had to demonstrate a sturdy build capable of withstanding 16 hours of work on their feet. The examination of the hands was one of the most important parts of this humiliating procedure. The managers looked for calluses on the palms, which served as proof of diligence and experience in hard physical labor. However, the hands were not supposed to be too rough if the applicant was applying for a position as a maid or a footman. Skin damaged by lye and stiff brushes automatically placed a woman in the category of manual laborers and laundresses. Every crack on the fingers could cost several shillings of annual pay. This paradox required applicants to maintain an acceptable appearance despite the grueling conditions of domestic labor. The dental examination resembled an inspection at a horse fair and provoked the greatest revulsion among applicants. Hannah recalled how she was forced to open her mouth wide under the bright light of a gas lamp. Healthy teeth guaranteed the employer that the employee would not waste time on treatment and would not lose the ability to work due to pain. Rotten teeth or missing teeth were considered a sign of low social status and bad habits. In an era without modern dentistry, a perfect smile was a rarity among the poor. This requirement instantly ruled out thousands of people from the possibility of getting a good job. Posture was checked using a special measuring ruler or a wooden slat. Candidates were made to walk across the room with a book balanced on their head or simply stand up straight against a wall. Slouching was seen as a sign of weakness or hidden spinal defects, which were unacceptable for carrying heavy trays. A straight back demonstrated obedience to the rules and a willingness to maintain order in the presence of the employers. For footmen, tall stature and perfect posture were the main assets for which wealthy families were willing to pay a premium. The physical perfection of the staff highlighted the employer's wealth better than any jewelry. Age was also subject to the strictest scrutiny, and many applicants tried to conceal their true age. Those who were too young were considered inexperienced and frivolous, while people over 40 were dismissed as physically worn out. The ideal age for hiring ranged from 20 to 35, when a person was at the peak of their physical condition. Offices often required birth certificates, but in the absence of these, managers relied on their own judgment. Grey hair or deep wrinkles could result in immediate rejection without the right to a second interview. People resorted to various tricks, such as dyeing their grey hair with soot or special concoctions. Physical attractiveness played a dual role in the candidate selection process. Maids who were too beautiful were often rejected as their employers saw them as a potential threat to the peace of the household. However, outright ugliness or noticeable scars also barred entry into London's respectable neighbourhoods. What was required was a specific, unobtrusive prettiness that would be pleasing to the eye, but not draw undue attention. A person was expected to look like a pleasant addition to the interior of a Victorian parlour. Striking this delicate balance required applicants to put on quite a performance during the interview. In addition to physical appearance, the cleanliness of their clothing and the absence of any distinctive odours were checked. Candidates spent their last savings on having their only presentable dress laundered before going to the agency. The smell of cheap tobacco, alcohol fumes, or dampness from the slums served as an immediate reason for rejection. Agency managers possessed an incredibly keen sense of smell, able to identify slum dwellers even when they were wearing clean clothes. Personal hygiene, in conditions where hot water was a luxury, became a real ordeal for the poor. It was a filter that divided the working class into reliable workers and outcasts. Hannah Calvick, having gone through these screenings, learned to hide her anxiety behind a mask of absolute indifference. She understood that any display of irritation or resentment would be interpreted as insolence and a rebellious nature. The ability to silently endure humiliating comments about her body was a vital survival skill. The administrators deliberately provoked the candidates with harsh remarks, testing their psychological resilience in the presence of their future employers. Anyone who lost their temper and began to argue was struck from the lists forever. Submissiveness was valued on par with physical strength and clean teeth. For each such screening, the applicant was required to pay the agency an enrollment fee. This money was non-refundable, even in the event of rejection, which turned the screenings into a lucrative business for agency owners. Thousands of people lined up every day, handing over their life savings for a chance to be evaluated. This system exploited the poor's hope for a stable income and a roof over their heads. The physical examination was only the first round of trials on the path to signing the coveted contract. But what happened when ideal physical attributes clashed with a bad reputation? In the heart of London, in unassuming pubs and the dark alleys of Fleet Street, a massive black market business thrived. The main currency here was not gold coins, but sheets of thick paper bearing forged signatures of prominent figures. A document known as a character reference, or written recommendation, determined the fate of every job seeker at employment agencies. Without this scrap of paper, a person could not even hope for a position as a lowly kitchen helper. The system, created to ensure the safety of employers, immediately gave rise to an industry of large-scale fraud. The letter of recommendation contained a detailed account of the employee's length of service, skills, honesty, and sobriety. Employers held absolute power over their subordinates, since refusing to issue a recommendation meant lifelong unemployment. If an employee left due to a conflict with their employer, they often found themselves without the coveted document, losing all prospects. As a result, people endured the harshest conditions, fearing they would lose their only ticket to the future. The power of the recommendation was so great that it became a tool for blackmail and coercion. Desperate workers left without their papers were forced to seek alternative ways to survive. It was precisely this demand that gave rise to the profession of character fabricators, who masterfully forged handwriting and family crests. For a few shillings, talented calligraphers could create a perfect past for anyone who wanted one. Among the clients of these underground calligraphers were not only victims of unjust employers, but also actual criminals. Thieves used forged letters of recommendation to infiltrate wealthy homes under the guise of experienced footmen or maids. Once they gained access to silver and valuables, they vanished into the night, leaving their hosts with nothing but a beautifully written forgery. The London police regularly raided offices suspected of selling forged documents, but the market simply went deeper underground. Newspapers of the time were full of warnings to employers about the need to personally verify every letter of recommendation. However, the anonymity of the vast city made this task virtually impossible. The most difficult part of the scam was arranging a face-to-face meeting or a response to a letter from a new employer. In London, there were entire networks of actors who, for a fee, could play the role of a former landlady. A well-dressed woman would receive the agent in a rented parlour and speak warmly of the candidate. Professional staffing agencies tried to combat this phenomenon by creating their own blacklists of unreliable employees. They exchanged information about detected forgeries and suspicious individuals attempting to secure employment. Managers learned to recognize standard phrases often used by inexperienced forgers. If a candidate was caught presenting forged documents, they were immediately turned over to the police on charges of fraud. The courts imposed severe penalties for such crimes, sentencing the guilty to prison or hard labor. The fear of exposure hung over every job seeker who had decided to buy themselves a new past. Despite the risks, the black market flourished as the social structure left people no other choice. A person without references was automatically equated with a vagrant, which was considered a crime in Victorian England. Purchasing a forged document was often the only way to avoid ending up in a workhouse. Many historians believe that this underground market played an important role in social mobility. It gave talented but wayward individuals the opportunity to start over with a clean slate in another part of the city. It was a desperate form of resistance against a system that judged people solely by their documentary record. Hannah Colvick, possessing genuine and glowing recommendations, watched in horror as others risked their freedom. She described instances when young women were taken away by constables right from the line for a poorly forged official seal. Her own papers were her greatest treasure, which she guarded more carefully than any money or jewelry. Hannah understood that a thin sheet of paper was the only barrier between her and the London underworld. An impeccable reputation was the most valuable asset a member of the working class could possess. Losing that asset meant social death. By the end of the 19th century, the rules for verifying references had become even more sophisticated and multi-layered. Special detective agencies emerged, offering services to covertly investigate the backgrounds of potential employees. They interviewed neighbors, shopkeepers, and former colleagues to paint a true picture of the candidate beyond the scope of official documents. This paranoid level of scrutiny made the hiring process even more time-consuming and humiliating. However, even impeccable credentials were of no help if the candidate belonged to the wrong religion. Are you ready to find out why religion and family status became an insurmountable barrier to employment? Almost every job advertisement ended with a short but ruthless phrase, "Irish need not apply." This national and religious filter was so commonplace that no one even tried to hide it. In Protestant England, Catholics were viewed with immense suspicion, bordering on open hostility. Employers feared that Catholic servants would spy on their behalf or spread heresy among the children. Religion became a marker of trustworthiness, and membership in the Church of England was a prerequisite for a successful career. At employment agencies, job seekers were asked directly which church they attended on Sundays. The wrong answer instantly closed the doors to respectable households. regardless of physical appearance or work experience. Candidates from Ireland often tried to hide their accents and changed their names to more English-sounding ones. They registered with Anglican parishes in an attempt to game the system and secure a coveted job. Agency managers deliberately asked questions in regional dialects to identify hidden outsiders. It was genuine social segregation entrenched in everyday life. Marital status was the second most powerful filter, weeding out a huge portion of qualified workers. Married women were categorically denied employment in positions that required living in the employer's home. It was believed that a married woman would think about her husband and children rather than the well-being of her employers. Pregnancy meant immediate dismissal, with the complete loss of all references and payments. Employers demanded absolute loyalty, which could not be shared with one's own family. An employee's personal life was viewed as an annoying hindrance to the effective performance of their direct duties. For men, the rules were no less strict, especially if they aspired to high-ranking positions as footmen or valets. Being unmarried was often stipulated in the contract as a mandatory condition for retaining one's job. Employers did not want to pay for the room and board of their employee's family, considering it an unnecessary expense. If a man decided to marry, he had to either resign or keep his marriage a secret for years. Many servants' families lived apart, seeing each other only a few times a month during short periods of leave. This system tore apart thousands of families, forcing people to choose between love and the ability to earn a living. Widows and orphans were treated differently, as employment agencies viewed them as ideal candidates. Orphans had no external ties or relatives who could intervene in their working conditions. They were completely dependent on their employers and agencies, which made them submissive and compliant. Charitable organizations often sent such people directly to the agencies, believing they were rescuing them from the streets. In reality, they were handing them over to a system of total control where they had no advocates. The absence of family became a competitive advantage in this brutal labor market. Relationships among the domestic workers themselves were also strictly regulated and monitored. Any romantic relationships between footmen and maids were harshly suppressed, even to the point of immediate dismissal for both parties. Employers feared that couples in love would cover up each other's mistakes or band together against their superiors. Evening walks and meetings outside of working hours were under the strict supervision of the housekeeper or butler. Personal space was limited to a narrow bed in a cramped room under the very roof of the mansion. A person was completely deprived of the right to privacy and their own feelings. Those who tried to circumvent these rules took enormous risks to preserve their personal lives. There are known cases where married couples took up residence in different houses, concealing their status and meeting in secret. They corresponded through trusted messengers and planned their rare days off so they could spend them together. Exposure threatened not only dismissal, but also being blacklisted by employment agencies throughout London. This forced people to live in constant fear, flinching at every unexpected question from their manager. The system compelled honest people to lie in order to preserve their basic human rights. This rigorous selection process created a unique social stratum of people permanently cut off from their roots. They did not belong to the class of their employers, yet they were also drifting away from their original social circles. Their workplace became their home, and their family was the strict hierarchy of similarly lonely workers. Employment agencies acted as ruthless architects of this artificial social environment. They created a world in which loyalty was bought at the cost of one's own identity. In the next chapter, you'll learn how these strict filters shaped a complex internal hierarchy hidden behind the doors of wealthy mansions. In 1873, Jane Nassau Sr., Britain's first female government inspector, entered the scene. She launched a large-scale investigation into the conditions under which young women were hired and quickly encountered resistance from the entire system. Jane visited London agencies, documenting humiliating screening procedures and harsh contract terms. She was shocked by how easily people's lives were exploited to serve the comfort of wealthy families. Her reports became the first official document to expose the cruel underbelly of the domestic labour industry. Jane Nassau Sr. began her investigative work with a thorough examination of the financial schemes of London agencies. She noted the complete vulnerability of candidates to agency owners who demanded money even for simply viewing job openings. The reformer documented numerous cases in which applicants were charged exorbitant fees, depriving them of their last savings. After paying these fees, women were often sent to households with unbearable working conditions or to employers of dubious reputation. Jane insisted that such a pre-screening system amounted to legalized robbery and grossly violated the basic human right to dignity. The owners of commercial agencies immediately launched a large-scale campaign to discredit the work of the first female inspector. They used London newspapers to publish scathing articles, claiming that strict rules were necessary to protect society from thieves and swindlers. The clash between pragmatic business interests and humanistic ideals escalated into an open and highly bitter public conflict. Conservative journalists accused the reformer of excessive sentimentality, which they claimed threatened to undermine the security of every respectable home in the capital. For Jane, this controversy became a battle not merely to change employment regulations, but for the very perception of working-class people in British society. In response to the systemic abuses she uncovered, Jane founded the Metropolitan Association for the Aid of Young Maids. This fundamentally new organisation offered an alternative path to employment, completely bypassing the brutal physical examinations conducted by commercial agencies. The association turned the usual logic of the market on its head by beginning to thoroughly inspect working conditions in employers' homes, even before sending a worker there. The organisation's inspectors examined the quality of staff quarters, the food provided, and the overall reputation of potential employers. Only after the safety of the home was confirmed was the employer granted the right to invite a candidate to fill the open position. To protect women from living on the streets while looking for work, the association established an entire network of safe houses throughout London. In these boarding houses, candidates could live for free or for a minimal fee, with absolutely no fear of being deceived by agents. Having a roof over their heads gave job seekers the opportunity to turn down bad offers rather than agreeing to exploitative conditions out of fear of going hungry. This was a direct and deeply painful challenge to the monopoly of the old agencies, which for decades had been accustomed to dictating their harsh terms to the entire market. In this way, the reformers sought to transform the hiring process from a cold, commodity money relationship back into a fair, human contract. Jane was particularly outraged by the humiliating practice of publicly weighing and measuring body proportions in the agency's offices. In her reports, she argued that such procedures inflicted irreparable psychological damage, creating a deep-seated inferiority complex. Treating people like workhorses at a fair, in her view, broke their will even before they began performing their professional duties. The reformer demanded an immediate end to the practice of palpating muscles and examining teeth, calling it a relic of the slave-owning system. Her arguments were based on the premise that physical endurance cannot be measured through a direct violation of bodily integrity. In her association's branches, the interview process was conducted for the first time as a respectful conversation between equals. Inspectors evaluated solely the applicant's professional skills, experience, and character, rather than the size of her wrist or the width of her shoulders. At first, the aristocracy viewed this gentle approach with great suspicion, considering it an unreliable filter for weeding out weak workers. However, over time, many well-meaning families realized the advantages of hiring motivated staff and began turning specifically to the reformers. Jane's ideas began to slowly but surely change public consciousness, compelling employers to avoid dubious commercial agencies. Jane Nassau Sr.'s tenacious struggle came at the cost of serious personal losses and immense psychological stress. Her health suffered greatly due to constant, hours-long inspection trips through the most troubled neighbourhoods of the British capital. She worked herself to the bone, facing daily aggression from conservatives and the owners of lucrative staffing agencies. Her opponents openly accused her of deliberately undermining traditional British values and encouraging sheer laziness among the poor. Despite her advancing illness, she refused to stop her work, considering the cause she had begun to be her life's mission. Despite enormous administrative pressure, she continued to methodically gather evidence that the old hiring system was completely obsolete. Her detailed reports contained hundreds of real-life stories that could not be refuted by dry bureaucratic form letters. This challenging professional journey became an example of incredible civic courage in the era of strict patriarchal norms in Victorian England. The most significant practical achievement of the reformers was a radical change in the legal status of employment contracts. They fought hard to ensure that contracts became fully bilateral, enshrining the rights not only of the wealthy employer, but also of the ordinary worker. For the first time, standard documents included mandatory provisions regarding minimum rest periods and the quality of meals provided. Strict requirements for safe living conditions were also introduced, prohibiting overnight stays in damp basements. Whereas a contract had previously been an act of voluntary servitude, it now began to vaguely resemble a modern employment contract with clear obligations. These progressive changes were implemented into everyday practice with great difficulty and constant delays. When resolving conflicts, city courts often, out of habit, sided with wealthy employers, ignoring the new rules. Magistrates refused to fine employers for violating rest hours, considering domestic labour not subject to strict government regulation. The associations had to hire their own lawyers to defend workers' interests in endless legal disputes. Nevertheless, the very existence of such legal documents marked a tectonic shift in the social policy of the entire country. At the same time, Jane waged a fierce battle against the entrenched system of written character references, which were often used as a tool for blackmail. She insisted that references contain only objective facts about the work performed, rather than the employer's subjective assessments. The reformer called for the creation of independent arbitration commissions to which workers could formally appeal in cases of unjust denial of employment papers. This would protect honest workers from retaliation by employers in conflicts over delayed wages. Such an initiative was intended to deprive employers of the ability to permanently ruin the reputation of an undesirable person with a single stroke of the pen. This radical proposal met with the most fierce resistance from the owners of London mansions. The aristocracy had absolutely no desire to lose its primary lever of pressure, which had allowed it to keep workers in absolute obedience for decades. Diplomatic negotiations between the reformers and representatives of the old elite dragged on for years, yielding only partial and very modest results. Although they never succeeded in establishing independent commissions, the public discussion of the issue forced many officials to become more cautious in their assessments. Nevertheless, the unshakable monopoly of fear of being denied a recommendation was called into question at the state level for the first time. The reformers' efforts laid the groundwork for change, but breaking down the entrenched system proved not so simple. The old agencies continued to operate, though they were forced to tone down the most odious forms of screening. Changing the laws could not instantly alter the mindset of people accustomed to viewing domestic staff as useful tools. Jane Nassau Sr. died without ever witnessing the complete collapse of the commercial staffing agencies she had fought against. However, her journey demonstrated that a single person with a clear purpose is capable of shaking the centuries-old traditions of a vast empire. In the next chapter, we will see the price paid by people who lived for years under this constant surveillance. Upon crossing the threshold of a wealthy household, a person often lost not only their freedom of movement, but also their own name. In the Victorian tradition, it was customary to rename servants for the convenience of their employers. If it was customary in a household to call all footmen John or James, a new employee would take on that name. This emphasized that what mattered was the position and function, not the personality of the person fulfilling it. Employers literally erased a candidate's past identity, replacing it with a standard, convenient label. The process of depersonalization continued with the selection of a strict uniform that completely concealed individual features. Clothing was issued by the mistress of the house and often belonged to the household itself, not the employee. It was forbidden to wear any jewelry, bright ribbons, or accessories that might make a person stand out from the crowd. Even hairstyles were strictly regulated. Hair had to be combed smoothly back and hidden under a uniform cap. A person was transformed into a faceless shadow, gliding along the walls of a huge mansion without drawing attention to themselves. The ideal servant was expected to be physically present in the room, but remain completely invisible to the owners and guests. This distance was maintained by a strict prohibition on eye contact and unnecessary conversation. Employees were trained to look at the floor or over the heads of the owners, responding only with short, memorized phrases. Any display of emotion, whether a smile, laughter, or tears, was considered a gross violation of discipline. Hannah Kalvik described this state as being inside a transparent box, where you can see the world but cannot participate in it. The psychological barrier between the inhabitants of the upper and lower floors was stronger than the mansion's brick walls. This invisible boundary shielded the aristocracy's comfortable world from the problems and suffering of ordinary people. Living conditions also contributed to the blurring of personal boundaries and the suppression of individuality. Servants often slept in cramped, unheated rooms in the attic, sharing a bed with colleagues. They had no place to store personal belongings except for a small wooden chest under the bed. Any letter or package could be opened and inspected by the housekeeper for the sake of the household's security. Privacy was considered a privilege of the wealthy, inaccessible to those who worked for a salary. Being constantly in the sight of colleagues and superiors created an atmosphere of total, exhausting control. The lack of personal time deprived people of the opportunity to grow or pursue their own interests. Long hours of monotonous physical labor led to emotional burnout and deep apathy. For years, people never ventured beyond their own neighborhood, unaware of what was happening in the rest of London or the world. Their planning horizon narrowed to the next day off or receiving a meager paycheck at the end of the month. The system squeezed the best years of their lives out of them, leaving in return only recommendations for their next job. This vicious cycle turned energetic young people into submissive and silent executors of someone else's will. The hardest trial was the realization that you could be easily replaced at any moment. Every morning, a worker knew that there were hundreds of people at employment agencies ready to take his place. This fear forced them to endure injustice, rudeness, and outright tyranny on the part of their employers. Perfect discipline was maintained not out of respect for the employers, but out of a panic-stricken fear of ending up on the street penniless. Agency owners skillfully manipulated this fear, constantly reminding workers of the long lines of job seekers. Competition in the labor market was the very whip that forced people to set aside their own pride. Despite this, a unique culture of support and mutual aid developed within the community of employees. Experienced workers secretly helped newcomers, teaching them the rules of survival and ways to circumvent even the strictest prohibitions. On the lower floors, real life was in full swing, hidden from the eyes of the bosses, with its own intrigues, friendships, and betrayals. These brief moments of human connection around the kitchen table were the only refuge from total loneliness. Here, people's real names resurfaced, and their true characters, hidden beneath stiff, starched collars, came to light. In this closed environment, people learned to preserve their dignity in the face of a humiliating system. Such a life demanded incredible psychological resilience, which was forged over the years. Many broke down, ended up in workhouses, or joined the ranks of London's homeless on the city's filthy streets. But those who persevered became true masters of their craft, possessing iron self-control and professionalism. They formed the backbone of Victorian society, ensuring the flawless functioning of the empire's highly complex machinery of daily life. Their labour went unnoticed, yet it was precisely this labour that made the existence of that brilliant era possible. In the next chapter, you'll learn how all these factors converged at a single decisive moment that forever changed a man's fate. What happens at the end of this lengthy process? is worth all the previous trials. We return to the cold office on Oxford Street, where Hannah Calwick has just finished her physical examination. The office manager lowered the measuring tape and spent a long time cross-checking the data with the entries in her thick ledger. The silence in the room became palpable as the pen scrawled the verdict next to the candidate's last name. Hannah knew that the decision was about to be made as to where she would spend the next few years of her difficult life. Every muscle in her body was tense in anticipation of the single word on which her future depended. "You're approved," the manager said curtly, sliding the heavy ledger toward Hannah for her to sign the contract. At that moment, the evaluation phase ended, and the process of legally assigning a person to a new home began. Hannah signed her name, carefully forming each letter, confirming her agreement to all the strict terms. She handed over her last few coins to the agency as a commission, leaving her completely without any means of support. Now there was no turning back, only a specific address in an affluent neighborhood and a time by which she was required to report. That stroke of the pen formally transformed the independent applicant into the property of her new employer. The walk from the employment agency to her new home was a brief moment of illusory freedom before long months of work. Hannah walked through the bustling streets of London, carrying all her belongings in a small, worn suitcase. She wondered what kind of people would meet her at the back entrance and what her new daily routine would be like. It was a time of hope that her new employers would be fair and the work manageable. In moments like these, her fear of the unknown mingled with relief that the exhausting search was finally over. Crossing the city was a symbolic bridge between a past full of uncertainty and a future of strict order. When she stepped through the servants' entrance, her final transformation into a worker at the mansion began. She was met by a stern housekeeper who immediately took her letters of recommendation and locked them away in a safe. Hannah was given a uniform, shown her bunk in a cramped room, and immediately sent off to carry out her first assignments. The intrigue and tension of the agency's interviews gave way to the routine of endless physical labor. She became part of a vast machine where everyone knew their place and performed their function. At that moment, the circle was complete. The merchandise had been evaluated, purchased, and put to work. This system persisted for decades before new economic realities forced society to change its views. With the development of factories and stores, people gained an alternative that did not require humiliating inspections of their teeth and posture. Young women began choosing jobs behind the counter or in factories, preferring independence to the comforts of a stranger's home. Employment agencies began to empty out, and employers were forced to relax their requirements to attract staff. The final decline of the era of strict vetting brought an end to an entire historical period, freeing people from this pressure. Today, the story of Hannah Calwick and thousands of other nameless workers serves as a stark reminder of the price of social comfort. Their journey through the employment agencies was a true test of endurance, where only the most resilient and patient survived. They navigated a system that sought to reduce their identities to a set of physical measurements and lines in a contract. Yet, even under these conditions, they retained their humanity, creating their own rules for survival. That era is now a thing of the past, leaving behind only the yellowed pages of the archives and Mrs. Beaton's strict rules. We've come a long way from the pages of strict reference manuals to cold employment agencies and underground calligraphy workshops. The history of employment in the Victorian era is not merely a list of absurd rules, but a story of total control and human resilience. The heroes of this era, from powerless job seekers to courageous reformers, showed how society can both build and tear down its own boundaries. A system that treated people like draft animals ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty and new economic freedoms. What aspects of modern hiring do you think resemble these old traditions? Suggest topics for future videos you'd like to see in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new historical investigations.